The numbers tell the story of an empire dying. April 1917. In the grey waters of the Atlantic, German submarines are destroying Allied shipping at a rate of 874,000 tons per month. 1 in 4 merchant vessels entering the waters around Britain will never reach port. The island nation, dependent on imported food, fuel and raw materials for its very survival, has grain reserves sufficient for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The mathematics are merciless. At current destruction rates, Britain will be starved into submission before the leaves turn. German naval planners have calculated this with Teutonic precision. Unrestricted submarine warfare will knock Britain from the war in 5 months, 6 at most. Yes, this policy will bring America into the conflict. But what can America do? It takes time to raise armies, build ships, train men. Germany doesn't need to win the war. It merely needs to end Britain's ability to fight one. And in April 1917, the numbers suggest they are right. What follows over the next 18 months constitutes one of the most remarkable reversals in military history, and one of the least remembered. By war's end, the U-boat threat will be broken. 2 million American soldiers will cross the Atlantic without losing a single transport to submarine attack. German submarine losses will triple. The convoy system, initially rejected as impossible, will reduce shipping losses from 25% to less than 1%. But this is not simply a story of technological innovation, though innovation there was. Nor is it merely a tale of American industrial might, though that might prove decisive. This is a story about something rarer and more valuable: institutional learning under existential pressure. About admirals who abandoned decades of doctrine. About navies that had never cooperated learning to fight as one. About men who developed, in mere months, the foundations of an entirely new form of warfare. Anti-submarine tactics that would save civilization twice in a single century. The Germans had unleashed something genuinely new, an invisible enemy that struck without warning and vanished without trace. The question was not simply how to fight submarines. The question was how to fight what you cannot see. The answers would come from the most unlikely coalition imaginable: tradition-bound British admirals, aggressive American destroyer captains, converted merchant ships with hidden guns, and scientists racing to develop technologies that existed only in theory. Together, they would invent modern anti-submarine warfare, and in doing so, they would save the world. To understand the crisis of 1917, one must first appreciate how thoroughly the submarine had upended 4 centuries of naval doctrine. Since the age of Drake and the Spanish Armada, naval warfare had operated according to certain immutable principles. Fleets met fleets. Battleships dueled battleships. Command of the sea was established through decisive engagement. Trafalgar, Tsushima, the great clashes that settled the fate of empires in an afternoon of thunder and smoke. The nation with the largest fleet controlled the waves, and the nation that controlled the waves controlled global commerce. The submarine rendered all of this irrelevant. Here was a weapon that refused to fight by the rules. It struck from beneath the surface, invisible until the moment of attack. It could not be brought to decisive battle because it could not be found. It cared nothing for the great dreadnoughts that had cost fortunes to build. Those floating castles of steel were useless against an enemy that declined to present itself for destruction. The submarine was, in the words of one frustrated admiral, a weapon of assassination, and like all assassins, it thrived on anonymity. The Germans had grasped this potential earlier than anyone. While the British invested in ever larger battleships, Germany quietly built a submarine fleet, designed not for fleet actions but for commerce raiding. The strategic logic was elegant in its simplicity. Britain imported 2/3 of its food and nearly all of its industrial raw materials. Sink enough merchant ships, and the empire would wither regardless of how many battleships it possessed. There was, however, a complication. International law, the so-called prize rules dating back centuries, required warships to surface before attacking merchant vessels, to provide for the safety of crews, to observe the niceties of civilized warfare. Submarines that followed these rules surrendered their primary advantage: invisibility. A surfaced U-boat was vulnerable to ramming, to gunfire, to any armed vessel that happened upon it. The Germans faced a choice between effectiveness and legitimacy. For the first years of the war, they attempted an uncomfortable middle ground. U-boats would surface, order crews to abandon ship, then sink their prey with deck guns or explosive charges. This preserved some semblance of legality while conserving precious torpedoes. But it was slow, dangerous, and increasingly impractical as the British began arming merchant vessels. By 1917, the German High Command had made its decision. On February 1st, Germany announced the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. Any vessel in the war zone around Britain, neutral or belligerent, armed or unarmed, would be sunk on sight. No warnings, no mercy. The calculated gamble was that this policy would starve Britain into submission before its consequences could take effect. The consequences, of course, included American entry into the war. But the Germans had done their arithmetic. The United States had a tiny army and would require at least a year to raise, train, and transport significant forces to Europe. Britain would be finished in 5 months. The American threat was real but distant. The submarine threat was immediate and existential. And for the first terrible months of 1917, the numbers proved them right. In February, U-boats sank over 500,000 tons of shipping. In March, the figure rose higher still. In April, the very month America declared war, German submarines destroyed 874,000 tons, the highest monthly total of the entire conflict. At this rate, Britain would lose half its merchant fleet within the year. The food situation grew desperate. Bread rationing loomed. First Sea Lord Admiral John Jellicoe confided to the Americans a grim assessment. Unless the submarine menace could be checked, the Allies would lose the war. The British Admiralty, that ancient institution that had ruled the waves for centuries, found itself paralyzed by a threat it could not answer. Its response to the submarine crisis was to do more of what it had always done: patrol the sea lanes, hunt for submarines, trust to the vigilance of individual ships. Thousands of vessels were assigned to anti-submarine patrol. They accomplished almost nothing. The ocean was simply too vast, and the submarines too small, too quiet, too patient. One U-boat captain described the experience with clinical detachment. His submarine would lie submerged during daylight hours, listening to the patrol vessels pass overhead, engines churning, completely oblivious to the predator beneath. When darkness fell, the U-boat would surface, recharge its batteries, and resume its hunt. The patrols might as well have been searching for a needle in a haystack, while the needle watched and waited. There was, in fact, an obvious solution. It had worked for centuries. In every previous era of commerce raiding, it was called the convoy. The principle was simple. Rather than scattering merchant ships across the ocean where they could be picked off one by one, group them together under armed escort. A U-boat might attack 1 or 2 vessels before the escorts could respond, but it could not sink an entire fleet. The mathematics of protection replaced the mathematics of destruction, yet the Admiralty resisted. The objections were numerous and, to the admirals who raised them, compelling. Merchant captains couldn't maintain formation. Convoys would create bottlenecks at ports. Escorts would be drawn away from patrol duties. Gathering ships together would simply create a larger target. The very idea seemed to represent a retreat from offensive action, a defensive crouch unworthy of the Royal Navy's traditions. Behind these tactical objections lay something deeper: institutional pride. The convoy system meant admitting that the world's greatest navy could not protect individual ships. It meant accepting that the submarine had fundamentally changed the nature of sea power. It meant acknowledging that 4 centuries of doctrine had been rendered obsolete by a steel tube filled with German sailors. This was a truth the Admiralty was not yet ready to accept. And so the ships continued to sail alone, and the U-boats continued to send them to the bottom, and the weeks ticked by as Britain's reserves dwindled toward exhaustion. It would take American pressure, combined with the sheer weight of accumulated disaster, to force the change that would save the Allied cause. On March 31st, 1917, 6 days before Congress would vote to declare war on Germany, a tall, sharp-featured rear admiral named William Sims boarded a passenger liner in New York under an assumed name. His orders were extraordinary: proceed to London, assess the situation, prepare for American naval cooperation with the British. He was to travel in civilian clothes, carrying no documents that might identify him, because America was still technically neutral and his mission was still technically secret. Sims was an unusual choice for this assignment, and a controversial one. Throughout his career, he had been an agitator and a reformer, the kind of officer who made enemies by being right. He had exposed the shocking inaccuracy of American naval gunnery at the turn of the century, embarrassing admirals who preferred comfortable illusions to uncomfortable truths. He had advocated for the all-big-gun battleship before most of his colleagues understood its significance. He was brilliant, abrasive, and possessed of a quality rare among senior officers. He was willing to change his mind when presented with evidence. This quality would prove essential in the weeks to come. Sims arrived in Liverpool on April 9th, 3 days after the American declaration of war. He proceeded immediately to London, where he was ushered into a meeting with Admiral John Jellicoe, the First Sea Lord. What Jellicoe told him, what the Admiralty had concealed from the world and even from its own government, left Sims stunned. The situation was far worse than anyone outside the inner circles of British Naval Command had been allowed to know. Jellicoe laid out the figures with the grim precision of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. Shipping losses were not merely serious, they were catastrophic. The published statistics had been systematically understated to maintain public morale. The true numbers showed Britain hemorrhaging tonnage at a rate that would exhaust its merchant fleet within months. Food stocks were critically low. Replacement construction could not keep pace with destruction. The U-boat campaign was succeeding. "It looks as though the Germans are winning the war," Sims said. Jellicoe's response was quiet and devastating. "They will win unless we can stop these losses, and stop them soon." Sims asked the obvious question, what about convoys? The First Sea Lord's reaction was dismissive. Convoys had been considered and rejected. The arguments were familiar. Merchant captains couldn't keep station. Ports would be congested. Escorts were needed for patrol work. Besides, the numbers didn't support it. Britain had 2,500 ships at sea at any given time. There weren't enough warships in the world to escort them all. But Sims was a man who trusted numbers, and these numbers struck him as wrong. He pressed for details. How many ships actually required escort? Not the coastal traffic, not the short-haul vessels, but the oceanic shipping that carried the bulk of vital supplies. The answer, when the Admiralty finally calculated it properly, was startling. The figure of 2,500 had included every vessel afloat in British waters, fishing boats, ferries, coastal traders. The number of oceanic arrivals and departures requiring protection was closer to 120 to 140 per week. This was a manageable figure. This was a problem that could be solved. The convoy question would take weeks more to resolve. Bureaucratic inertia is not easily overcome, even in wartime. But Sims had identified the essential truth. The Admiralty had been measuring the wrong thing. They had counted ships when they should have counted voyages. They had seen an impossible task when the possible task was hiding in plain sight. In the meantime, Sims had a more immediate mission: get American destroyers to European waters as quickly as possible. He cabled Washington with an urgency bordering on desperation. Forget the battleships. Forget the grand fleet actions that American naval planners had spent decades preparing for. What Britain needed, what the entire Allied cause needed, was destroyers, small, fast, expendable vessels capable of escorting convoys and hunting submarines. Every destroyer America could spare should be sent immediately. The response from Washington was complicated by politics, pride, and the same institutional resistance Sims had encountered in London. The Navy Department had its own plans, its own doctrines, its own vision of how American sea power should be employed. Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels and Chief of Naval Operations Admiral William Benson were skeptical of British strategy and reluctant to subordinate American forces to foreign command. Benson, in particular, harbored deep suspicions of British motives. "We would as soon fight the British as the Germans," he had reportedly remarked. But Sims persisted, and the logic of the situation ultimately prevailed. On May 4, 1917, the first American destroyers, 6 vessels of Destroyer Division 8, under Commander Joseph Taussig, departed Boston for Queenstown, Ireland. They arrived on May 4, Battered by Atlantic storms, low on fuel, their crews exhausted from 2 weeks of hard steaming. The British liaison officer who met them asked when the Americans would be ready for operations. Tausig's response would become legend. "We are ready now, sir." It was not bravado. Within days, the American destroyers were at sea, escorting convoys through the submarine zone, learning a new kind of warfare through brutal on-the-job training. More destroyers followed, 35 by July, with additional flotillas operating from Brest, Gibraltar, and other bases. Navy, which had entered the war with just 51 destroyers in total, halted construction of battleships and began building escorts at a pace that would have seemed impossible months earlier. By war's end, 266 new destroyers had been authorized. The American contribution was not merely material, it was catalytic. Sims, operating from London with a small staff, became an advocate for convoy within the Allied command structure, an American voice pushing British admirals toward a policy their own junior officers had long supported. On May 10, 1917, the first experimental convoy sailed from Gibraltar, 16 merchant ships, escorted by armed cruisers. It arrived in Britain on May 22 without losing a single vessel. The results were immediately dramatically clear. In the 3 months following the introduction of Atlantic convoys, of nearly 9,000 ships sailing in convoy, just 27 were lost to submarines. The loss rate for convoyed vessels was less than 1%. For ships sailing independently, it remained catastrophic. By autumn, the convoy system had become universal. By year's end, the crisis had passed. Britain would not starve. The Atlantic would not become a German lake. The bridge of ships carrying American soldiers and supplies to Europe would be built and defended. But the convoy was only part of the answer. Protecting ships was essential. It was not sufficient. As long as U-boats could operate with impunity, they would adapt, find weaknesses, develop new tactics. The Allies needed not merely to defend against submarines, but to destroy them. This required solving a problem that had confounded naval minds since the first submarines slipped beneath the waves. How do you kill what you cannot see? The fundamental problem of anti-submarine warfare in 1917 can be stated simply: you cannot fight an enemy you cannot find. A submarine on the surface was vulnerable, slow, fragile, easily outgunned by any warship. But a submarine beneath the waves was invisible. No technology then existed to detect a submerged vessel. Hydrophones, underwater microphones capable of picking up engine noise, were primitive, unreliable, and nearly useless against a submarine running on silent electric motors. Radar was decades in the future. Sonar, or ASDAG as the British would call it, existed only as a research concept. The first practical systems would not be deployed until after the armistice. The Allies were hunting blind, and yet, hunt they did. The first anti-submarine tactics were almost comically crude. In the war's early months, the only reliable way to sink a submarine was to catch it on the surface, and the only way to destroy it once found was by gunfire or ramming. The British armed cruiser HMS Badger rammed and sank SMU-15 in August 1914, the first submarine destroyed in the war. It would not be the last vessel to try this medieval approach, with all its obvious limitations. Ramming required finding a surfaced submarine, closing the distance before it could dive, and successfully striking a maneuvering target with a vessel designed for speed rather than impact. It was desperate, dangerous, and decidedly inefficient. There had to be a better way. The answer came in the form of a weapon that seems obvious in retrospect, but required considerable ingenuity to develop the depth charge. The concept was straightforward. If you knew approximately where a submarine was lurking, you could drop an explosive charge set to detonate at a predetermined depth. The pressure wave from an underwater explosion, far more destructive than the same blast in air, could crush a submarine's hull, rupture its seams, or damage it enough to force it to the surface. You didn't need to see the submarine. You didn't need to hit it directly. You needed only to get close enough. The first British depth charges entered service in early 1916. Crude devices, little more than barrels filled with explosives, rolled off the stern of a destroyer and set to detonate by hydrostatic pistol at a fixed depth. They were inaccurate, Unreliable and available in pitiful quantities, a destroyer might carry only 2 charges. A single attack would exhaust its entire supply. But the technology improved rapidly under wartime pressure. By 1917, the standard British depth charge, the Type D, nicknamed the ash can for its cylindrical shape, contained 300 pounds of TNT and could be set to explode at depths between 40 and 200 feet. Destroyers carried racks of them on their sterns and could launch patterns of charges to blanket a suspected submarine position. The Americans contributed their own improvements, including the Y-gun, a device that fired depth charges off both sides of a ship simultaneously, allowing a destroyer to bracket a submarine rather than simply dropping charges in its wake. The mathematics of destruction began to favor the hunter rather than the hunted. Yet depth charges, for all their growing effectiveness, required knowing where the submarine was, and this knowledge remained maddeningly difficult to obtain. A U-boat might reveal its position by attacking a convoy, but by the time destroyers could respond, the submarine had often slipped away into the vast anonymity of the ocean. The Allies needed to find submarines before they attacked or to lure them into revealing themselves. This second approach produced one of the war's strangest innovations, the Q-ship. The logic of the Q-ship exploited a peculiar vulnerability in German tactics. Submarines, as we have noted, preferred to attack with deck guns rather than torpedoes when possible, surfacing to engage targets, conserving their limited supply of expensive torpedoes for high-value targets or emergencies. This meant approaching their victims at close range, well within gun range. What if the victim was not what it appeared to be? The British began converting merchant ships into floating ambushes. Outwardly, these vessels, called special service ships, mystery ships, or simply Q-ships, appeared to be ordinary tramp steamers, fishing trawlers, or coastal traders. Their hulls were deliberately allowed to rust and streak, their crews dressed as merchant sailors, often affecting foreign accents or nationalities. They flew neutral flags until the moment of engagement. Everything about them proclaimed harmless vulnerability. But behind hinged deck panels, inside fake cargo containers, beneath disguised lifeboats, the Q-ships concealed batteries of 12-pounder guns, depth charges, and trained Royal Navy gun crews waiting in silent tension. The performance that followed a U-boat's appearance was pure theater. When a submarine surfaced and ordered the ship to halt, the Q-ship would comply. A panic party of sailors, carefully rehearsed for their roles, would appear to abandon ship in confusion, lowering lifeboats with exaggerated haste, shouting in apparent terror, sometimes carrying personal effects or a caged parrot for verisimilitude. The captain might emerge in civilian clothes, wringing his hands, pleading for the lives of his crew. All the while, the hidden gun crews remained frozen at their stations, scarcely breathing, waiting for the U-boat to close to point-blank range. When the submarine captain, convinced he faced a helpless merchantman, brought his vessel alongside to finish the job, the Q-ship's sides dropped away, the white ensign ran up the mast, and a storm of gunfire erupted at a range where missing was nearly impossible. The most celebrated Q-ship commander was Captain Gordon Campbell, who would earn the Victoria Cross for his exploits. In February 1917, commanding HMS Farnborough disguised as a collier, Campbell allowed his ship to be torpedoed rather than break cover prematurely. With the vessel listing and taking water, he waited until U-83 surfaced to examine its kill, then opened fire and sent the submarine to the bottom. Farnborough somehow remained afloat long enough to be towed to port. Campbell's crew had absorbed a torpedo hit to preserve the deception. Such tactics required extraordinary nerve and discipline. The gun crews might wait for hours in their concealed positions, unable to move, forbidden to make the slightest sound, as a submarine circled and probed. The panic party risked their lives in open boats while shells splashed around them. The entire operation depended on maintaining a lie under conditions of mortal danger. And yet, for all their dramatic appeal, Q-ships achieved only limited success. Over the course of the war, they sank perhaps 11 German submarines, while losing 44 of their own number. As U-boat commanders grew warier, they began torpedoing suspicious vessels without warning, denying Q-ships the close engagement on which their tactics depended. The theatrical gambit had been clever, but the enemy learned the script. The real solution to submarine detection would have to wait for technology that did not yet exist. The Americans had begun work on what they called supersonics, echo-ranging devices that could, theoretically, locate a submerged submarine by bouncing sound waves off its hull. British scientists pursued similar research under the designation AS-DAX. Both programs showed promise, but neither would produce operational systems before the armistice. In the meantime, the most effective detection method remained the oldest human eyes, watching from the decks of escort vessels, or increasingly, from the air. Aircraft had obvious advantages for submarine hunting. From altitude, a pilot could spot the shadow of a submerged submarine far more easily than a surface lookout. Airships and seaplanes could patrol vast stretches of ocean, forcing U-boats to remain submerged. And a submarine forced to submerge was a submarine that could not attack, could not see, could not pursue, and would eventually exhaust its batteries. The Allies deployed hundreds of aircraft in the anti-submarine role. Seaplanes operating from coastal stations, non-rigid airships, blimps capable of hovering over convoys for hours, and even tethered observation balloons towed by destroyers. These aircraft rarely sank submarines directly. Their bombs were too small, their aim too imprecise, but their presence fundamentally changed the mathematics of submarine warfare. A U-boat captain who might cheerfully attack a convoy defended only by surface escorts would think twice if an airship floated overhead, watching his every move. The statistics were striking. Of the 257 ships lost from convoys during the war, only 5 were sunk while aircraft assisted the surface escort. In 1918, U-boats attacked convoys protected by both ships and aircraft only 6 times, sinking just 3 vessels out of thousands. The combination of convoy discipline, surface escorts, and air patrol had transformed the submarine from apex predator to hunted prey. But the Allies were not content merely to defend. As the convoy system took hold and shipping losses declined, a more aggressive strategy began to take shape, one that would strike at the U-boats not in the open ocean, but at the choke points they were forced to traverse. This strategy would produce the largest minefield in the history of warfare. The problem could be seen on any map of the North Sea. German submarines based in the Baltic or the North Sea ports had 2 routes to reach the Atlantic hunting grounds. They could thread the narrow Strait of Dover, passing between England and France, a gauntlet increasingly choked with mines, nets, and patrol vessels. Or they could sail north around Scotland, through the vast waters between the Orkney Islands and Norway, a passage some 230 miles wide and nearly impossible to patrol. By 1917, the Dover route had become so dangerous that most U-boats avoided it entirely. The high seas flotilla boats sailed north about, accepting the longer voyage in exchange for safer passage. If this northern route could be closed, if the entire North Sea could somehow be transformed into a death trap, the submarine campaign would be strangled at its source. The idea was not new. British planners had considered and rejected it repeatedly. Mining 230 miles of open ocean, in waters reaching depths of 900 feet, would require hundreds of thousands of conventional mines, a production and deployment challenge beyond anything previously attempted. The Royal Navy's own estimates suggested 400,000 mines would be needed. The proposal seemed more fantasy than strategy. The Americans saw it differently. Within the US Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, engineers had been developing a revolutionary new mine, the Mark VI, designed specifically for anti-submarine warfare. Unlike conventional contact mines, which detonated only when a vessel struck them directly, the Mark VI featured a copper antenna extending 100 feet above and below the mine case. When a submarine's steel hull contacted this antenna, it completed an electrical circuit that triggered detonation. A single Mark VI could effectively cover a 100-foot column of water. This antenna design transformed the mathematics of the barrage. Instead of 400,000 mines, the Americans calculated that 100,000 would suffice, still an enormous number, but within the realm of the achievable. The proposal found a champion in Franklin D. Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, who appealed directly to President Wilson to overcome skepticism from naval traditionalists. Admiral William Sims, now commanding American naval forces in Europe, had his doubts about the project's feasibility, but did not stand in its way. The British, initially dismissive, agreed to cooperate if the Americans would supply the mines and personnel. What followed was a triumph of American industrial mobilization. The Mark VI mine was divided into 7 component parts, each manufactured at a separate facility to maintain secrecy. Automobile factories, their civilian production curtailed by wartime restrictions, converted to mine production, bringing to bear the mass production techniques that had made American industry the envy of the world. Parts flowed from factories across the country to a central loading plant at St. Julian's Creek, near Norfolk, Virginia, where they were assembled, loaded with explosives, and shipped to Scotland. At bases in Inverness and Invergordon, American sailors assembled 1,000 mines per day, an astonishing rate that overwhelmed the British expectation of what was possible. The mines were loaded aboard a fleet of converted cargo ships, 10 vessels operating in rotation, sailing out into the North Sea to seed the waters with death. The first mines were laid on June 8, 1918. Over the following 5 months, American minelayers made 13 expeditions into the barrage zone, deploying mines in a carefully calculated pattern. The field stretched in 3 sections. Area A, the central and largest portion, was purely American. Areas B and C, off the Scottish and Norwegian coasts respectively, were mined primarily by the British, but supplemented with American mines. By the time the armistice halted operations on November 11, 1918, the barrage contained 70,623 mines, 56,611 American and 13,652 British, stretched across 230 miles of ocean in a band 15 to 35 miles wide. It was, by far, the largest minefield ever created. The explosive content exceeded 10,000 tons of TNT. The total cost approached $80 million, a staggering sum for a single military project. The barrage presented U-boat commanders with an agonizing dilemma. A surfaced submarine in daylight required 3 hours to transit the field, running a gauntlet of 6 to 10 rows of mines while exposed to air patrol. A submerged submarine, safer from aircraft, took twice as long and faced even greater risk from the mines themselves. German minesweepers could not clear safe channels without exposing themselves to Allied surface forces. The only alternative was the long voyage around the British Isles, adding days to each patrol and consuming fuel that might otherwise sustain operations in the hunting grounds. How effective was the barrage? The question is surprisingly difficult to answer. The field was completed only days before the war ended, leaving no time to assess its full impact. Records indicate at least 6 U-boats sunk by barrage mines and 6 more severely damaged. Other submarines simply disappeared without explanation during this period. The mines may have claimed them as well. But the barrage's significance extended beyond the submarines it destroyed. The psychological effect on German crews was substantial. U-boat sailors already endured conditions of almost unbearable stress. The claustrophobia of extended submerged operations, the knowledge that any attack might be their last, the constant threat of depth charges from an enemy they could not see. Now they faced hours of passage through a minefield of unprecedented density, never knowing if the next moment would bring the crushing explosion of a Mark VI antenna mine. German morale, already fragile, after years of attritional warfare, cracked under the cumulative strain. In October 1918, sailors of the High Seas Fleet mutinied rather than undertake a final sortie against the British. The submarine service remained more disciplined, but the aggressive spirit that had driven the U-boat campaign was gone. Fewer patrols were undertaken, fewer risks were accepted. The hunters had become the hunted. The transformation can be measured in statistics. In the first quarter of 1917, before American entry and before widespread convoy adoption, Germany lost an average of 3 U-boats per month. By the final quarter of 1918, monthly losses had risen to between 8 and 12 submarines, a 3-fold increase. Over the war's final year, the German submarine fleet lost more than 60 boats to Allied action. The mathematics of destruction had reversed. For the men who served on American destroyers, these statistics translated into moments of desperate violence, brief, chaotic encounters in which years of naval tradition meant nothing, and survival depended on reflexes, training, and luck. Consider the experience of USS Fanning on November 17, 1917. Fanning was escorting a convoy through the submarine zone southwest of Ireland when lookouts spotted a periscope cutting through the grey swells. The destroyer peeled away from the convoy and raced toward the sighting at flank speed, her crew rushing to battle stations. As Fanning passed over the submarine's estimated position, depth charges rolled off her stern, the first American attack on a German U-boat. The explosions churned the sea white. For long seconds, nothing happened. Then, impossibly, the bow of U-58 broke the surface at a steep angle, driven up by the force of the blasts. The submarine hung there, mortally wounded, as her crew scrambled through hatches in desperate escape. Fanning and her sister ship Nicholson circled like wolves, firing on the stricken U-boat until it slipped beneath the waves. 40 German sailors were pulled from the water, prisoners of war, the first captured by American forces in the Atlantic campaign. It was a small victory in a vast war, but it carried symbolic weight beyond its tactical significance. The US Navy had drawn blood. Not every encounter ended so favorably. The very day after Fanning's triumph, the destroyer US Cassin was pursuing U-61. When the submarine turned and counterattacked, torpedo tracks appeared in the water, racing toward Cassin's stern, toward the depth charge racks loaded with high explosives. Gunner's mate Osmond Ingram saw the danger first. The torpedo was seconds from impact. If it struck the depth charges, the resulting explosion would destroy the ship and kill everyone aboard. Ingram sprinted toward the stern, intending to jettison the charges over the side, to dump them into the sea before the torpedo arrived. He almost made it. The explosion caught him at the depth charge racks. The blast tore away Cassin's stern, killed Ingram instantly, and left the destroyer crippled but afloat. She would survive to be repaired and fight again. Osmond Ingram would not. He became the first enlisted man of the US Navy to be killed by enemy action in the First World War, and the first to receive the Medal of Honor posthumously. A destroyer would later bear his name. Such sacrifices, multiplied across hundreds of engagements, gradually broke the back of the U-boat campaign. The German submarine force, which had come so close to winning the war in the spring of 1917, found itself increasingly outmatched, outnumbered, and outfought. Convoy escorts grew more numerous and more skilled. Air patrols made surface operations suicidal. The North Sea Mine Barrage closed the northern passage. Detection technologies, while still primitive, improved month by month. The Germans attempted to adapt. In May 1918, they launched the only coordinated group attack of the war. 6 U-boats operating together in what might be called a prototype wolf pack, attempting to overwhelm convoy defenses through concentration of force. The results were disastrous. The group encountered several convoys and sank just 3 ships, while losing 2 submarines, including U-103, rammed and sunk by the troopship Olympic, sister ship of the ill-fated Titanic. The tactical coordination proved nearly impossible to maintain from submerged positions. The experiment was not repeated. By autumn, the submarine campaign had effectively collapsed. Monthly Allied shipping losses, which had peaked at 874,000 tons in April 1917, fell to 283,000 tons by October 1918, and even this reduced figure included losses outside the convoy system. Ships sailing in convoy suffered negligible casualties. The supply lines to France were not merely intact, they were carrying the largest military expeditionary force in American history. 2 million American soldiers crossed the Atlantic between April 1917 and November 1918. Not one troopship sailing in convoy was lost to submarine attack. The significance of this fact can hardly be overstated. Germany's entire strategy had rested on the assumption that submarine warfare would knock Britain out of the war before American military power could make itself felt. The U-boats had failed. The convoys had succeeded. And now those 2 million American soldiers were pouring into the Western Front, tipping the balance that had held in bloody stalemate for 4 years. On November 11, 1918, Germany signed the armistice. The war that had consumed a generation was over. In the harbor at Harwich, more than 160 German U-boats surrendered to the Royal Navy, the tangible evidence of a campaign that had come within weeks of victory before collapsing into defeat. The submarines were inspected by curious Allied sailors, then dispersed to Allied nations as war prizes, or scuttled in the years that followed. Their crews were shipped home without ceremony, returning to a Germany convulsed by revolution and facing the bitter consequences of total defeat. The greatest submarine campaign in history had ended not with a bang, but with a surrender. What are we to make of this story? A century removed from its telling, the numbers themselves are staggering. Nearly 5,000 Allied merchant ships sunk, representing some 12 million tons of shipping. Close to 15,000 British merchant sailors killed, civilians technically, though they faced dangers as great as any soldier. 178 German U-boats destroyed, with roughly 5,000 submariners lost. The material costs alone would have seemed unimaginable to the naval strategists of 1914, who had expected a short war of decisive fleet actions. But the deeper significance lies not in the statistics, but in what they reveal about the nature of military innovation under pressure. The Allied victory over the U-boat was not foreordained. In the spring of 1917, the submarine campaign was working precisely as German planners had predicted. Britain was genuinely facing starvation. The Admiralty's traditional responses were failing utterly. Had the convoy system been delayed another few months, had institutional resistance proven stronger than institutional learning, the war might have ended very differently. What changed was not technology, at least not primarily. The depth charge existed before the crisis. The convoy concept was older than the Royal Navy itself. What changed was the willingness of senior leaders to abandon failing doctrines and embrace solutions that challenged their deepest assumptions about how navies should fight. This required a particular kind of courage, not the physical bravery of combat, though there was plenty of that, but the intellectual courage to admit that decades of professional expertise had prepared one for a war that no longer existed. Admiral Jellicoe, for all his initial resistance, eventually supported the convoy system. Admiral Sims subordinated American forces to British command when every instinct of national pride urged independence. Junior officers and civilian scientists, whose ideas had been dismissed, suddenly found themselves listened to because the alternative was defeat. The institutions learned, slowly, painfully, against their own ingrained resistance. But they learned, and then they forgot. 20 years later, a new generation of German submarines would again threaten to sever the Atlantic lifeline. The Battle of the Atlantic in World War II would dwarf its predecessor in scale and ferocity, longer, bloodier, fought with technologies that would have seemed miraculous to the sailors of 1918. And once again in the war's early years, the U-boats would come terrifyingly close to success. The convoy system, proven beyond doubt in 1917 to 1918, was initially resisted in 1939 to 1940. The lessons of the North Sea Mine Barrage were largely forgotten. The hard-won understanding that submarines required systematic, technological hunting rather than random patrol had to be relearned through bitter experience. Thousands of sailors died because institutions that had mastered anti-submarine warfare 20 years earlier had allowed that mastery to atrophy. Perhaps this is the nature of military knowledge. Each generation must learn anew what its predecessors knew, because the knowledge lives in people rather than in plans, and people retire and die and take their wisdom with them. Perhaps institutions, like individuals, are prone to remember their triumphs while forgetting the failures that preceded them. Or perhaps the lesson is simpler and more unsettling, that the hardest part of any war is not fighting the enemy, but fighting one's own assumptions. The men who broke the U-boat campaign of 1917 to 1918 did not possess superior technology. They did not enjoy numerical advantage. They were not, as individuals, braver or more capable than those who had failed before them. What they possessed was the willingness to think differently, to recognize that the old ways were failing, and to embrace the new ways quickly enough to matter. In the cold waters of the North Atlantic, In the grey months of a desperate war, they invented modern anti-submarine warfare. The convoys they organized, the depth charges they deployed, the detection methods they pioneered, the mine barrages they constructed. These became the foundation upon which the next generation would build, and the generation after that, down to the nuclear submarines and hunter-killer groups of the present day. They learned to hunt the invisible enemy, and in learning they saved the world.